Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to a lore video where we'll be talking about the upcoming Total War Warhammer expansion, the races found within it, their relationships with one another, and a little bit of background lore. I have done lore videos on all four of these races previously, so if you do wish to learn a little bit more, do go and check those out. But for now, let us start with the true masters of Lustria, the Lizardmen. On this map right here, you will see the primary areas that the Lizardmen control. As you can already tell, their territory is mostly found around the intact temple cities, which are vast, sprawling complexes of ziggurat temples and other magnificent buildings built during the dawn age of the Warhammer world by the Southlands, and potentially even their masters, the enigmatic Old Ones. These temple cities are placed in strategic locations to protect magical ley lines that wander through the entire Warhammer world. These are very, very powerful connections that were originally used as a web to circumfare the entire planet in a protective shielding of magical energies to protect against the influence of chaos. During the Sundering, the Great Breaking at the dawn of time, where chaos broke into reality and pretty much fucked up everything, the Slan Magepriests and the High Elves both managed to just barely save the world from being completely destroyed by chaos. And as we have seen in the expansion, the web of magical protection that was cast across the world and strengthened during those times looks like it might be crumbling, which would be a very, very bad thing, and the primary motivation for the Lizardmen will undoubtedly be to stop this from happening. Which means their motivations are pretty damn simple. They don't want anyone to be touching their magical nonsense, and they will happily club anyone to death that tries. As for their relations with the other races, well, it's a little bit interesting. The Slans consider the other races to be creations of the Old Ones, but they also consider them to be non-vital creations. Essentially, they will look upon intruders into their realm with a certain very suspicion and try to determine whether or not these creatures are part of the great plan of their mysterious creators. If they are, they will leave them alone. For example, in the case of the High Elves, which came to their land long, long ago. The Lizardmen studied them intensely and decided, yeah, these pointy-eared creatures seems nice enough, so we won't kill them. And the High Elves are therefore left to roam the lands of Lustria more or less safely, as long as they don't try to wander into one of the temple cities, in which case they're almost certainly going to get their pretty little brains scattered all over the floor. And that pretty much goes for anyone, be they humans, elves, or whatever the hell else. If you get too close to the temple cities, you're probably going to get bludgeoned to death, with very little in the way of warning. However, if you are simply wandering the jungles of Lustria, the Lizardmen are unlikely to pay you too much attention as long as you're not getting close to something they consider to be valuable and or important. As for outright diplomatic relations, though, they really don't have any. They consider most of the other races to be lesser races, far beneath their notice. They are simply just the various fauna that were created by their masters, and therefore they're not really important. Lizardmen would never really maintain diplomatic relations with, well, anyone, really. However, they would trade with other countries, other nations, other species, although it is not entirely sure whether or not this is the wishes of the Slans themselves. You see, the Lizardmen society is divided into kind of classes, or sub-races would perhaps be a more correct term. You have the Skinks, who are born and bred to do the menial work. They hunt, they cook, they clean, they forage, and they do preventative maintenance on the temple cities and serve the Slan masters directly. You've got the Sauros, which are treated as the warrior class and are spawned specifically for combat purposes, for guarding valuable things, or to hunt down intruders, or even if somebody managed to sneak into a city and steal something, an army of Sauros warriors warriors would be dispatched to bludgeon the fuck out of them and bring whatever they stole back home to the temple city. And then there are the Kroxigors, massive lumbering creatures whose sheer size and strength make them fearsome combatants, but they were originally bred for purposes of construction. Guided by skink overseers, they would haul massive stone blocks and pile them upon each other to build the massive temple ziggurats that the Slan mage priests inhabit. But again, being very, very large and very, very strong means it's a very, very good dinosaur for bashing the shit out of people as well with giant bronze clubs. And finally, of course, there are their masters, the Slan mage priests, who busy themselves with important things, like pondering how the Old Ones decided to do everything. And they will ponder literally everything. A leaf falls somewhere in the jungle, and there's probably a Slan wondering why. And this pondering takes up pretty much all of their time. They leave the day-to-day running of the temple cities, as running goes, to the skinks. Which means that while there has been tales of skinks trading with other people, human settlements even, that might not be actually what the Slan mage priests told them to do. They might not have gotten the order, go out and trade with the humans. The skinks might simply have decided that, well, we could simply just trade some meat with the humans and get some fruit in return, or vice versa, for example. Because as far as they're concerned, the humans are just other animals, just like them. They are part of the Great One's plan, and if they're willing to help out with the skinks' tasks, then so be it. Of course, the skinks would never allow the humans to actually get close to their temple cities, obviously, but they would quite happily trade with minor tribes, or, well, happily. I'm not entirely sure how common it is. I have heard mention of it, and I have read about it, but no mention as to exactly how common it is. So I'd probably assume it to be relatively uncommon. To put it bluntly, the Lizardmen really would not have any diplomatic relations with anyone except maybe the High Elves, and that is about it. But again, they wouldn't be outwardly hostile either. Strictly speaking, in the lore, the Lizardmen are more or less pacifists. They would never actually attack anyone, beyond making sure that their temple cities are safe. That's all they really care about, protecting the Old One's various artifacts and important locations. E.g., if you don't go near a temple city, the Lizardmen aren't going to fuck with you, although they do occasionally launch little punishment expeditions against settlements that give refuge to adventurers and treasure hunters and other people that might steal the Lizardmen's shiny stuff. And if, let's say, an adventurer managed to sneak into a temple city and steal said shiny things, then the Lizardmen will pursue him to the ends of the earth, and they will happily beat to death anything that gets in their way. In a Total War Warhammer game, however, maybe that will have to change. Maybe the Slans simply decide that, okay, we're gonna need some help here and we will ally with other species. And I wouldn't really mind that too much, because it's not that egregious. It's not like dwarves allying with vampires or anything like that. It is a relatively plausible thing to have happen, because all you really would need to do to explain this is say that the mage priest found some dusty old one prophecy that said, "Oh, and ye brave people of Kekistan shall wander forth from the jungle and be friends with the soft pink-skinned humans," and that'd be pretty much all you need. So they could definitely have diplomatic relations with other factions, although I'd expect it'd be very, very hard to achieve anything but a trade treaty with them originally. As for their military, Lizardmen are born and bred for very specific purposes. For example, skink skirmishers are pretty much born to be skink skirmishers. They use blowpipes or poisoned javelins to harass the foe and or hunt in more peaceful times. There are also chameleon skinks, which can blend into the environment and fire harassing fire with their blowpipes into enemy units. And then you have the proper main combat line being formed by the mighty Sauros warriors. The Sauros are very, very strong, very, very tough, and possessed of a natural armor, wielding big old bronze weapons which are rather horrifying. If a human gets hit by the full force of a Sauros warrior's cudgel, there's going to be very little left of said human. They are also cold-blooded reptiles, which means they are very, very slow to panic. They don't really give that much of a shit about massive, scary creatures charging into them screaming their lungs out, and you're gonna have to kill a lot of Lizardmen before they decide to run away. And of course, you also have the massive beastly Kroxigors capable of smashing apart pretty much anything. In fact, Kroxigors are slightly superior to trolls in this regard, since Kroxigors can also use massive goddamn bronzen cudgels to smash and smush and crush. They're not particularly bright, in fact they're outright idiots, but still they're pretty damn good at smishing and smashing. You've also got a bunch of various cool-ass dinosaurs, one including a giant crossbow on its backs, and also flying creatures, which are skinks riding pterodactyls, which is awesome in and of itself. You've also got the Engine of the Gods, which is essentially a giant magically dinosaur-powered laser beam, which is exactly as awesome as it goddamn sounds. And of course, you have so much magic. The Lizardmen have very little in the way of ranged firepower beyond short-range javelins and blowpipes, and occasionally some giant lizards which they prod to spit poison at their foe, but they make up for this in the sheer overwhelming power of their magical barrage. The Slann Mage Priests are some of the most powerful mages in the Warhammer world, and the Skink Priests are no slouches themselves, meaning that the Lizardmen are almost certain to dominate any magic phase. Now, granted, Total War Warhammer's lack of a dispel magic is a huge problem with this, and I'm hoping this is something that will be implemented in this expansion, because otherwise, if they're going to do justice the sheer overwhelming magical potential of the Slann Mage Priests, I fear they might get horrifyingly overpowered. And finally, if the Lizardmen could be said to have a weakness, it would probably be the relatively slow nature of their troops. They would be relatively quick to tire in all due likelihood, and they would not be particularly fast. They do have cavalry, which is really good shock and melee cavalry, but again, not particularly fast. They would be a relatively slow, relatively plodding army with a fairly weak missile contingent, but extremely powerful melee. They would be very tough, very strong, very durable, and they would have incredible magical potential. Next up on the list, we have the ever fluffy and adorable Skaven, the best race to have ever fantasied in any fantasy universe ever. And in this case, most probably Clan Pestilence. We might be seeing all of the clans, we might just be seeing the Skaven, or perhaps we will be seeing just Clan Pestilence. We will have to wait and see. I'm kinda hoping for at least a mix of all of them, perhaps under the overall leadership of Clan Pestilence, because my favourite clan, Scryer, needs to bring some of their magical doodahs and boom to Lustria, and I wouldn't mind some Clan Eshin ninja rats while we're at it. As for their position on the Lustrian mainland, there's not a whole lot of it at the moment. They used to actually have control over considerable portions of the jungle. In fact, at one point, Clan Pestilence had almost defeated the Lizardmen and had razed several of their temple cities. However, after the coming of the Serpent God that nom-nommed a lot of poor little innocent Skaven, there's not a whole lot of them left. They still have an enclave under the city of Quetzal, and a small presence around the altar of the Horned Rat, but they're not really army-sized, or even really any kind of threat to the Lizardmen. They're essentially the scattered remains hiding from the Lizardmen at this point. However, here's the important part. The Skaven, as we all know, do absolutely love their little tunnels, and they have managed, through some magical fucking means, don't ask me how they did this, but they have managed to dig what is essentially a transatlantic tunnel. Again, don't ask me how the fuck the Skaven managed to dig a transatlantic tunnel, but there we bloody are. Meaning that Quetzal is at the moment directly connected to the old world and Skaven blight. This would mean that the Skaven would be able to avoid all of that nasty little ship stuff and simply travel directly into Lustria, pouring their millions upon billions of lovely, fluffy little creatures directly into the heart of the Lizardmen's territory. In fact, it is uncomfortably close to Itza, the first city and seat of Lord Croak, although it is a considerable distance away from the City of the Sun, where the only announced Lizardman Lord currently has his seat. But still, there is a lot of Skaven, and the Skaven can thrive in the jungle. Not individual Skavens. Individual Skavens are going to get eaten by flesh-eating plants and club-wielding dinosaurs, but Skavens by the thousands will be able to live and thrive in the jungle by eating their dead, and whatever else they come across that has beaten the shit out of 15 or 16 other Skaven and is brought down by number 18, that feasts very, very well that particular night. As for motivations, well, they're Skaven. They don't really need any motivation to simply desecrate and absolutely fuck over a new and wonderful place brimming with life. Tasty life. But if they do need an actual motivation, they have it aplenty. Lustria was the scene of one of the greatest defeats that Clan Pestilence has ever suffered, and that's saying something considering how many times Clan Pestilence has fucked up, but oh well, and Lord Skrolk would most definitively want to wander back over there and have a word with the local inhabitants. Plus, of course, the temples, cities of the Lizardmen are filled to the brim with various magical treasures and ancient scrolls, all of which Lord Skrolk would be all too happy to take a massive steaming rat shit on to desecrate, then smear the shit all over the pages, thereby enhancing them somehow, and breed new and interesting poxes, toxins, and other virulent diseases from the desecrated remains. That's pretty much what Clan Pestilence do. The hint is kind of in the name. I'm really hoping that we'll be seeing some of that in the campaign map. Maybe the Skaven can expend a certain amount of magic or warp tokens or whatever to curse an enemy city and strike it down with pestilence, poison, and horribleness. That would be fun. They should definitely have a corruption mechanic of their own. Wherever the influence of Clan Pestilence spreads, the land should rot away, almost like a Nurgle infestation, and it should be absolutely fucking horrible. In fact, it should be so bad that normal Skaven should actually be taking attrition in those same areas. I would absolutely love to see a quad corruption mechanic for the Skaven. Essentially, you would have agents from all main 4 factions. Eshin, Moulder, Scryer, and Pestilence all competing over the same territory, trying to out-influence each other. If Clan Scryer has the influence in the area, they'll be generating more tech point in that settlement. If Clan Pestilence has control over the area will be poisonous to enemies and allies alike. If Clan Eshin has control over the area, they will have increased abilities to carry out covert missions and other such nonsense, and if Clan Moulder has control over the area, many wonderful beasties will be available as mercenaries. Corrupted rat ogres, giant snakes, horrible fish monsters that walk on land, all kinds of nonsense and craziness. God, I fucking love the Skaven. We probably won't be seeing that, but damn, but I could fucking hope for that, wouldn't I? The Skaven are a fantastically fluffy-wuffy, delicious, awesome species, and I would really like to see their siege battles. I'm hoping that Creative Assembly isn't going to be copping out on this like they did with the Dwarven Carax, which is just essentially a completely and utterly bog-standard siege battle, except there's a cave roof overhead. The Skavens have gargantuan underground cities, massive teeming complexes filled to the brim with millions upon millions of Skavens living their daily rats, backstabbing their friends, eating their corpses, and then getting backstabbed in return, while making all kinds of wonderful zany inventions like giant warpstone-infused nuclear bombs, toxins, plagues, all manners of wonderfulness. The Skavens really are the absolute best. If anything, a siege battle against the Skaven should just be this gargantuan city complex filled with narrow streets and kill corners. You'd have little walls set around the place, barricades, horribleness, and every time you pass a fucking building, a small stream of rats would come screaming out of it and attack your troops. Though, of course, they should be virtually useless as far as actual combat power goes, but still, Skaven everywhere. The more Skaven, the better. This is the simple truth of the goddamn universe, and the sooner you accept that, the happier you will be. Anyways, as for their actual army mechanics and their diplomacy, let's start with the diplomacy part. Do the Skaven have diplomacy? Well, kinda. Basically, a Skaven will promise you literally everything. He will promise you the world, the moon, the galaxy, that massive giant sea monster that can be seen off the coast of Lustria, all for the low, low price of your very fucking soul. Since he will inevitably backstab you. The only constant in Skaven politics is that every single alliance will end with one or both of the parties having a dagger sticking out of their spinal cord. This does, however, unfortunately mean that many of the established races might have some teensy-weensy trust issues when it comes to dealing with the Skaven. In all due essentiality, the only ones that would even consider making any kinds of diplomatic bonds with the fluffy-wuffy Ratmen are stuff like Chaos or Dark Elves, and the only reason they do it is because they are of the opinion that they can backstab the Skaven before the Skaven backstab them, and that is pretty much it. I don't imagine the Skaven having any kind of trade relations with the Empire or Lustria or anyone whatso goddamn ever in all due reality. They really shouldn't be able to maintain any kind of diplomatic bonds with anyone for any kind of extended period of time. Literally, if you somehow manage to get an alliance with the Dark Elves, for example, there should be a little counter on the side going tick, 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 and ticking down until the alliance is automatically broken by one of your underlings backstabbing a Dark Elf, or vice versa. And that should pretty much be it. I would love to see many, many different Skaven clans, so maybe even give us all 4 clans and make them independent, so the various clans can fight in amongst each other. That'd be cool, I would love that, but other than that, there's really not a whole lot of Skaven diplomacy. As I mentioned, they might be able to ally very, very temporarily with the forces of Chaos or the Dark Elves, but none of this is ever going to last any kind of time, so I might say that the best way to handle them in a Total War game is to literally have a ticking clock, or even just random events. You allied with them, okay. Now, every turn there's a random increasing percentage chance that something goes horribly wrong and the alliance is broken. I would actually love that. It might feel a little bit RNG and silly, but it would be exactly how the Skavens would actually behave. So, diplomacy? Not really, to be honest with you. As for the army, though, this is where shit gets interesting. The Skavens are one of the most unique fantasy armies in Warhammer, seeing as they base themselves almost entirely off of the wonderful concept of expendability and meat shields. I want to see the Skaven units having a regenerating attachment. So, here's my idea. You have a basic unit of clan rats, which are the basic warrior rats of the Skaven Empire. They're shit at pretty much everything, but they're cheap as dirt. However, you can attach a Skaven slave unit to that unit, as essentially as an upgrade. What that means on the battlefield is that the unit of clan rats will have an additional free unit that does not take up an army slot of, let's say, 100 Skaven slaves. These Skaven slaves should be virtually useless as far as combat goes. Like, all 100 Skaven slaves would, statistically speaking, trade themselves for about 10 Empire swordsmen in total, and that is it. However, they would be a fantastic way of bogging down the enemy. And if you don't make them free units like this, no one is going to use them, because why would you ever use an actual unit you need to maintain and keep as a expendable unit, when you could just have another proper warrior unit? You would never do it. It's entirely pointless. They might be able to summon them via magic, but damn, that feels gay, you know? Because Skaven slaves clawing their way out of the ground like fucking zombies or something would look really, really silly, so I would much prefer the expendable unit thing. And they really do need to be expendable to get the Skaven field, not just Total War Warhammer expendable, like, oh, this is a cheap unit, yeah, but I could just have a better unit in that slot. Like, why would you ever take a unit of zombies, as the vampire counts, for example, when you could take a unit of skeletons? They're just better, and the price difference is so minuscule, it's really not worth debating, you know? And there has to be proper expendability, because the Skaven will happily fire into close quarters combat. Now, granted, in Total War Warhammer, all races can do this. In Total War Tabletop, only the Skavens were able to fire directly into melee, because Skaven doesn't give a shit. If a Skaven blasts open the head of a friendly Skaven, well, first and foremost, he was probably a slave, and if he wasn't, he was probably planning to do the exact same thing to you. Therefore, killing another Skaven, as far as a Skaven is concerned, is nothing but an act of entirely justifiable and indeed necessary, nay, righteous, act of self-defense. Maybe do something like giving all Skaven units firing into melee some form of damage bonus, maybe. Of course, you should also give them a heightened chance of hitting friendlies, but, you know, that might work, that'd be cool. So, the Skaven army, how would it function? Well, you would have the Skaven slaves. Normally speaking, they would be driven in front of the army as a massive teeming horde of hundreds, if not thousands, of screaming Skaven slaves, which are completely without value. Their only duty is to bog down the enemy and bog down everything. Literally, on tabletop, I would use Skaven slaves as a means of redirecting cavalry charges. I would place them in front of my Skaven slaves and go, "Oh, so, you want to charge me with your super heavy and extremely expensive cavalry, do you? Well, you're gonna have to get through the fucking meat shields first." And he would go like, "Aha! I can kill your little Skaven slave easy enough." And he charges in, murders a butt ton of them, and he go like, "No. Because I have a leader nearby, they are not gonna fucking rout. Now, prepare your anus to get countercharged by 3 goddamn units of Skaven." And this is pretty much how I would like to see them work in Total War Warhammer as well. The Skaven slaves would be an entirely expendable screening unit, making the enemy waste their ammunition and use up their charges, while the clan rats move in through the units, get into melee, and flow around the flanks, etc., vastly outnumbering the enemy. Honestly, the average unit of Skaven should be like 200 or something, and they should be shit. But there should be absolute oceans of them, while also using many, many wonderful mechanical inventions, like the Doom Flare, which is just a giant bouncing ball of mechanical death that goes whirling through the enemy, or Warp Lightning cannons, or Poisoned Wind Globadiers, because mustard gas is always fun, especially when minced with a little bit of the raw stuff of chaos additionally, with rat ninjas poking around the enemy's rear lines, stabbing their artillery, and all kinds of wonderful monsters like rat ogres ripping through enemy lines, combined with a rather powerful magical force itself, the Grey Seers being able to bring down a lot of very powerful and very unique magic, which, while being extremely unstable, is also absolutely goddamn devastating. The main strengths of the Skaven army obviously would be the sheer numbers of models and the zany, wacky, crazy natures of their special weapons like massive Jessiles and Warp Lightning cannons, which might very well rip holes through your own ranks, but they might kill a few enemies as well, and the enemies are bound to be a lot more expensive than your Skaven, while their primary weakness would be their relatively low maneuverability and lack of overwhelming firepower. They don't have archers or crossbows like other races. Instead, they have highly specialized units of Jessiles, which are massive flintlocked weapons firing balls of concentrated warpstone the size of your fist. It will punch right through pretty much any armor in existence and do absolutely unspeakable things to the poor fleshy creature inside. However, they do not have the ability to fire volleys of fire. They will have very, very quick, very short bursts of fire, rather than the sustained, constant fire of enemy units. Maybe give them a very limited supply of ammunition or a very slow fire rate, for example. They also almost completely lack cavalry and fast units, although the Skavens themselves are considerably faster than the basic human, so a Skaven clan rat would run much faster than most infantry units currently available in the game, but they wouldn't have anything to catch really light cavalry, for example, and stuff like that, so they are vulnerable to getting skirmished to death, essentially. And of course, the simple fact that Skaven are pretty damn shit at combat. Even the best of Skavendom's warriors, the mighty Storm Vermin, will only really be about the same as another faction's basic units, but again, there's gonna be a lot of them. And then let's move on to the exact opposite of the lovely fluffy little Skavens, the pointy-eared faggots. So, the High Elves and the Dark Elves. Let's start with the more noble version, the High Elves, since the High Elves actually have a permanent settlement in Lustria, which makes them rather unique. The Citadel of Dusk is not merely an outpost, or a village, or a trading post, or even just an open port like many of the human settlements in Lustria are. It is a fully functioning city by High Elven standards that is being tolerated by the Lizardmen. Because for some mysterious reason, the Lizardmen took one look at the pointy ears and went, yeah, we like these people, they can be our neighbours. And they've simply just allowed them to stay. In fact, they've even had some forms of communication between them, which is very unusual for the Lizardmen. Extremely unusual, in fact. They even kinda trust them in a semi-alliance military fashion, seeing as they know that the High Elves fought against Chaos as well, and therefore they consider them to be part of their great master's plans to fight against the evil Chaos powers. The High Elves on their side view the Lizardmen, well, with a bit of curiosity and a bit of mistrust. They are giant toad creatures that live in the forest. They don't really want to give away any of their secrets, but are clearly ridiculously powerful mages. It's obviously a little bit of an odd situation for the High Elves, seeing as they usually consider themselves vastly superior to pretty much everything else, to find a bunch of bloated toads casting magic and calling down goddamn meteors from the skies with nary an effort. That probably shattered their worldview just a little bit. And of course, beyond their relatively modest holdings in Lustria, they have their home island of Ulthuan. This is also where the Vortex is located, on the Isle of the Dead, although, to be entirely honest, considering the magical nature of said Vortex, its purely physical location, so to say, is not necessarily that important, seeing as its metaphysical magical location might essentially be the same thing. Basically, if someone managed to break into one of the magical ley line wells in Lustria, they might very well be able to strike directly at the Isle of the Dead without actually having to go through Ulthuan itself. Additionally, there might be some Dark Elves in Ulthuan. There was a mention on the Steam page that Malekith was using his Black Ark to land presumably in Lustria, but maybe also in Ulthuan. It would not be the first time that Ulthuan has been invaded by the forces of the Witch King, so it's quite possible that we might see some Dark Elf presence in the lands of the High Elves as well as in Lustria, which would be quite interesting, and obviously the High Elves would have absolutely no diplomatic relations whatsoever with the Dark Elves. Absolutely fucking none. They most definitely would not deal with the Skaven either, or any forces of chaos or anything like that. They might have a tenuous alliance with the Lizardmen, and they would be more than happy to ally with the Empire or Bretonia, and kinda with the Wood Elves. They've got a little bit of a testy relationship with the pointy-eared tree huggers, but they are still kin. They would most definitively not ally with the dwarves. Not outright. They might ally with them via proxy. Basically, if the dwarves are allied to the Empire, and the dwarves show up in a battle with the Empire, the High Elves won't run over there and stab them in the face through sheer goddamn spite, but they won't enjoy their presence either, let's just say. Other than that, they will have pretty normal diplomatic relations, which is rather unique, considering the current bunch of bastards we have in front of us right here. As for their motivations, well, their motivations is obviously to protect the Vortex and the Island of the Dead, because if the Vortex goes boof, Ulthuan goes boof with it. Best case scenario, the island will simply sink beneath the waves. Worst case scenario, hordes and hordes of screaming billions upon jillion trillion zillions of screaming angry bloodthirsty demons will pour forth from the rift in reality and face fuck every single pointy-eared within a billion miles radius, and then go on to fuck the rest of the known universe. It'd be pretty bad, to put it bluntly. And when it comes to their army, the High Elves would probably have one of the best armies in the entire game. Even their basic spearmen, which are in all due technicality merely militia forces, should vastly outperform Empire spearmen in pretty much everything. Defense, offense, weapon skill, weapon damage, armor, practically everything. They should be better than them. Now granted, they're not as tough as humans, but their armor makes up for a fair bit of that. Their large shields, which they wield with a great amount of expertise, should make them virtually immune to missile fire, and their expertly used spears should make them extremely good against pretty much everything. I'd really like to see them have some special formations that reflect their elite nature. Like maybe they could form a shield wall with their spears poking out, maybe a testudo, maybe a circle, maybe even a full-on phalanx-esque formation to demonstrate the fact that these are elite, superbly trained troops, marching in perfect formation, more than able to outclass pretty much any soldier of any other faction. They should be the absolute crème de la crème. But then, of course, you have the elites amongst the elites, with the High Elves having some of the best archers in the world, some of the best cavalry in the world, and even dragons with heroes riding upon them. I mean, we've already been told that we have Teklik, which is one of the finest non-Slann mages in the world, and Tyrion, which is unarguably the best goddamn combatant in the entire Warhammer world, and he could also potentially be mounted on a cocking dragon. So yeah, the High Elves should be pretty damn good at fighting, but there should be very few of them. Like, the average unit size of the High Elves might be something along the lines of 80, or even lower, down to 60 for their elite units, but they should be incredibly good. I would be really sad to see the High Elves having standard unit sizes and just being basic troops, because they really shouldn't. They should have the feel of an elite army, being super good, super powerful, extremely disciplined, and really, really hard to fight. But there should be very few of them. You should be wanting to fight them by surrounding them, by sweeping around their flanks, overwhelming individual units and splitting them off from the rest. That is how you should fight a High Elf army, since in a straight-up brawl, they should frankly kick the shit out of pretty much goddamn anything. And as for weaknesses, honestly, the only real weakness they would have would be their limited numbers. They have excellent mages, excellent ranged power, with great ballistas that literally can never misfire, which, since in Total War Warhammer there is no misfire, maybe give them a higher accuracy, higher rate of fire, something like that. They have fantastic infantry, amazing elites, great archers, some of the best cavalry in the old world, and dragons. But, again, there's not that many of them. They should be very expensive, they should be very few in numbers, and generally speaking be very limited in how they can maneuver across the battlefield, simply because they can't really spread out. They can't form in a long line formation like, for example, other armies could. Simply just envelop the elf army and hit them from every single direction at once. That would be really great. I'm really hoping they go for a more elite feel for them, because currently the elite units we have don't really feel as elite, and it kind of gets a bit bothersome with the balancing when you have really super powerful units that are only balanced by their cost in the game, and to be honest, there are certain factions that can get money so goddamn easily that they might as well field entire armies purely of elite units, and indeed that is exactly what happens currently in Total War Warhammer, because you have so much money that there's no real reason to use basic units once you've established a relatively large empire. The punishment of recruiting extra generals too, which incur an extra cost upon your total leadership, makes it even less interesting to have more armies, meaning that the elite forces are considerably more powerful. I do think that is something that should be looked at. And then finally we come to the Dark Elves. Hardly any less elite than their cousins, they are, however, rather different in their love for BDSM and sadism and other less than entirely sanctioned ways of sexualizing each other via the use of spiky gadgets and or leather straps. They do not have a permanent residence in Lustria, although, as mentioned in the blurb, they do have their black arcs, which they can pretty much just ram onto any shore, and therefore create a permanent residence. A black arc, for those of you who do not know, is one of the massive elven fortresses that were torn from Ulthuan Ulthuan during the Sundering. They're essentially massive floating castles, heavily fortified, heavily armed, and with everything a budding Dark Elf Lord needs to keep himself and his men well supplied through the long and dirty trek through Lustria. Other than that, they do of course also possess the Land of Chill, known as Naggaroth, a not entirely fruitful or particularly nice place to live, seeing as it's rather cold, rather shitty, not very fertile, and the only thing that really grows there in any significant numbers is hardy pine trees, which they use to build boats from, because the Dark Elves are quite fond of boats. Additionally, the lands of Naggaroth are haunted by all manners of monstrosities, and a favoured vacation target for many Norscan tribes and Chaos followers, which did prove to be a rather inconvenient little problem for the Dark Elves when they first showed up there, but after quite a few years of fortifying, they are now more than able to simply murder the various marauding tribes of Norscans as they wander into Dark Elf territory. The land does have some benefits, however. The Burning Sea, for example, does have a rather unconventional benefit, in that it is filled to the absolute goddamn brim with bloodthirsty sea monsters of all manners of descriptions, from giant horrifying sea snakes to hydras to medusas to all manners of nonsense that will murder, eat, and fuck pretty much everything they come across. As to exactly how this could possibly be seen as a positive thing, well, let's just say that the Dark Elves have gained a certain amount of interest in capturing, breeding, and training these lovely creatures, and then unleashing them upon their enemies, taking great delight in the amount of carnage created by unleashing a 7-headed hydra that hasn't had a good meal in 7 months upon the poor little High Elves. As for their motivations, well, let's just say that the Dark Elves have plenty of reasons to fuck with the High Elves. Regardless of anything else, any chance of screwing over the Isle of the Dead and sinking Ulthuan is one that the Dark Elves would most certainly leap headfirst at, with no hesitation whatsoever, as their leader. The Witch King Malekith was originally supposed to take control over all elves. The elves used to be unified under the rule of so-called Phoenix Kings, and Malekith was the next successor. And while the Phoenix King is not a hereditary position, it is often customary for particularly fine sons of the previous Phoenix Kings to take over the seat, and Malekith had a particularly excellent pedigree. As such, it was seen as an almost surety that he would become the next Phoenix King, until a few uncomfortable little events happened, and Malekith was no longer entirely sure that he would be elected, so he did what any reasonable, level-minded and good proper politician would do in such a situation. He killed all of his political competitors in a coup, leaving him the only guy standing. But that is not enough to make a Phoenix King. You also have to pass through a ritual, the Flames of Assyrian. The flames will burn anyone that is not worthy of bearing the Phoenix crown, but anyone that is worthy will be able to pass through the flames unharmed. Unfortunately for Malekith, when he wandered into the flames, the god went, "Nope, fuck you," and turned him into a marshmallow crisp. He popped out on the other side, burned to an absolute goddamn cinder, and is currently only being kept alive by his magical armor, underneath which he is a mess of broken, burned scar tissue. The fact that he is even alive in the first place is testament to his incredible magical potential. However, in the end times, if you read that shit, and if you are a giant, enormous winky faggot, then you will know that Malekith's real title is not Malekith the Witch King, but Malekith the misunderstood bitch of the East. As the gods were simply fucking with him. They went like, well, let's give him a little bit of pain, and if he can persevere, then he will be the rightful Phoenix King. But Malekith turned out to be too much of a bitch to enjoy being burned alive. I know, what a faggot. I mean, who can't stomach being burned alive for a few seconds? I mean, come on. Anyways, he bitched out, and the gods could not impart upon him their full blessings, which means that he wasn't the proper Phoenix King. They couldn't properly endorse him, and as such, the realms of the elves were riven in a civil war with those that didn't like Malekith and the fact that he had stabbed everyone else that talked against him, and the other side, consisting of those people that still had faith in Malekith, despite the fact that at this point he looked like a well-done marshmallow, or perhaps something along the lines of a stick figure covered in shoe polish. regardless of which interpretation you find to be more correct, he didn't look very good or particularly mighty, but hey, they'd already kind of thrown their lot in with him at this point, and if they turned their cloaks now, it's a pretty good chance that the other High Elves, which now possessed an overwhelming abundance of moral superiority, would simply just stab them through the throat and call it a day. So, for better or worse, they were kinda stuck with him, and as such, they left the lands of Ulthuan behind and went to Nagaroth to seek shelter. Again, according to the Fag Times, this was all just a misunderstanding, and the next time Malekith wandered into the flames, the gods accept him, and therefore Malekith did nothing wrong, and everyone gathered around him and went like, "Ah, I guess you weren't such a bad guy after all. I know you ran an empire of murder, torture, sadism, and violence for the last 700 goddamn years, and you broke our alliance with the dwarves, ushering in an apocalyptic conflict that left both our races shattered and allowed chaos to take over the rest of the world, and essentially everything is your fault, but it is all forgiven, because our God said that while you might have been a bit of a bitch the first time, you are now forgiven, and all is well and fine in the world, except then the entire goddamn planet exploded. So maybe, just maybe, accepting Malekith as the Lord of the High Elves, Wood Elves, and the Dark Elves wasn't such a good idea after all. But hey, what do I know? And as for their diplomatic relations with other factions, well, the Lizardmen are having a bit of a hard time telling Dark Elves from High Elves. They are most definitively aware that one is far more likely to steal their shiny stuff than the other, but they still haven't quite figured out why the same species are fighting each other, because this, as far as the Lizardmen are concerned, is absolutely, utterly fucking ludicrous. It's entirely pointless. Why would a race created by the Old Ones start stabbing each other through the neck? That just doesn't seem to be any kind of logic whatsoever. So they don't really treat the Dark Elves with the kind of suspicion and outright disgust that they probably should if they want to keep their shinies safe, but they are still pretty much aware that the ones in purple and black are far less trustworthy than the ones in white and blue. Might just be the color scheme, who knows? As for everyone else, though, the Dark Elves might have some form of temporary alliances with the Skaven, although again I weigh heavy weight on the word temporary, and they might also have equally temporary alliances with the forces of chaos. As for everything else, well, they're not particularly well trusted by the Bretonnians, or the Empire, or the Dwarves in particular, although many of these races have a hard time telling the High Elves apart from the Dark Elves, because the High Elves themselves haven't actually told anyone about the whole Civil War thing. It is their shame that they have to carry deep within themselves. And so, while it might have made a whole lot more sense for the High Elves to simply send an ambassador to the Empire and go, so, okay, so we're in the middle of a bit of a civil war here, so if somebody in, black and purple or something like that shows up at your door, just, kick their asses, because they're not us, and they're douchebags. I mean, they are genuinely terrible people. Literally Hitler, you might even say. To give you an example, the prevailing porn search on Elf Hub in Nagaroth is a particularly vile combination of BDSM and spiked cocksleeve. They are actually the worst. But until the High Elves actually come to their senses and decide to tell their allies about this on a large scale, granted, they have told individuals about them, and they have kind of hinted at it occasionally, but again, there's still a lot of confusion in the old world about the difference between the High Elves and the Dark Elves. Again, they recognize that some elves are considerably more likely to stab them and steal their merchant shipping than others, but still, it's not really diplomatically understood, so you might argue that the Dark Elves could potentially be able to swing some trade deals, non-aggression pacts, and maybe even alliances with many of the old world nations through sheer ignorance, but, it should be very, very difficult. But other than that, there's nothing really stopping them from getting diplomatic relations with others, beyond the simple fact that they of course enjoy murder, death, fucking everything they come across to death, and capture slaves for the primary purpose of torturing them to death. But beyond those minor impediments, there's nothing really stopping them from establishing nice and mutually, well, at least one way, advantageous relations with other races. As for their armies, they're a lot like the High Elves. They should be low in numbers with very elite troops. They're mostly flavor differences. For example, while the High Elves use archers with exquisitely carved bows, the Dark Elves use repeating crossbows. While the High Elves again use wonderfully engineered bolt throwers, the Dark Elves use repeater bolt throwers. They also have some differences in their cavalry. While the High Elves ride beautiful elven horses, the Dark Elves ride giant fuck-off dinosaurs with really, really bad tempers. The Dark Elves also use a lot of monsters in their armies, like hydras, and they have a very, very different style of magic, focused far more on inducing pain and horrible suffering rather than outright killing their enemies, although they still have a very, very solid magical barrage. As for weaknesses, they would have much the same weakness as the High Elves. Low unit numbers of extremely elite units, but they would be very, very mobile. They'd have really good short-range firepower, not as good long-range firepower, and they might not have the same staying power as their High Elves cousins, as a lot of their units will be far more lightly armored, far more offensively minded. Basically, while the High Elves might in many occasions seek to outlast the enemy, and then hit them hard with elite units, the Dark Elves might be far more likely to simply just try and shred and tear their way through the enemy formations with Witch Elves and Executioners and massive monstrous creatures like the Hydras. It is a bit of an oversimplification, but you might say that the Dark Elves would be a far more offensive, shredding, tearing, ripping, charging army, while the High Elves would be a bit more of a defensive, solid line counter-attacking force, perhaps. Right then, and with that has been my fairly general, relatively simplistic, because, I had to do 4 races at once, video, a brief explanation of the 4 various factions that we will be seeing. Again, this is about the length of one of my videos on each of these races individually, and there's far, far more lore to be had, but as a general breakdown of a little bit of their background, their positions, their diplomacy, and their potential army, I feel like this has been a relatively informative little video. So, until we get a little bit more information, I think I'll leave it at that. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.